In early 1941, before the United States had even entered World War II, a peculiar and enormous fighter prototype rolled out of Republic Aviation's Long Island factory. It looked nothing like the sleek and nimble aircraft of its day. Standing more than 14 feet high and weighing nearly 7 tons when fully loaded, the machine seemed too heavy to fight, too big to climb, and far too clumsy to dance with the Luftwaffe's agile Messerschmitts. Yet inside this steel behemoth was a promise, one that would redefine aerial combat and alter the course of the air war over Europe. Its name was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately known to those who would fly it as the Jug. To understand how this giant came to be, one must first step into the mind of its creator, a Georgian-born immigrant named Alexander Kartveli. Having fled the turmoil of the Russian Revolution, Kartveli found a new home in America, where his brilliance in aeronautical design soon caught the attention of aviation pioneer Alexander Seversky. Together, they would push the boundaries of American aircraft engineering. But it was Kartveli's vision alone that would produce one of the most formidable fighters of World War II. By the late 1930s, air warfare was evolving at an unprecedented rate. European skies thundered with the engines of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Messerschmitts. Engineers and tacticians were discovering that altitude and speed were the new keys to survival. Yet in the United States, fighter aircraft still followed traditional concepts: light, small, and agile. Kartveli saw the flaw in this approach. He knew that as aircraft climbed higher into the thin atmosphere, piston engines struggled for power. The solution, he believed, was brute force, a powerful engine paired with a turbo-supercharger system capable of maintaining horsepower even above 25,000 feet. It was a radical idea. Build a fighter around the biggest, most powerful engine possible, the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double wasp. The engine itself was nearly 2,000 horsepower, a twin-row radial monster. But to make it perform effectively, Kartveli designed an intricate duct system that carried exhaust gases to a rear-mounted turbo-supercharger and then back to the engine's intake. The result was an aircraft with unmatched high-altitude performance, though it came at the cost of size and weight. The Republic P-47 would be the largest single-engine fighter the world had ever seen. When the first prototypes took to the air in May 1941, test pilots were both astonished and skeptical. The P-47B roared down the runway, its immense engine thundering like a freight train. It could reach more than 400 miles per hour at altitude, a remarkable feat for its day, but its takeoff run was long, its climb rate sluggish, and its handling heavy. One pilot remarked that flying it felt like trying to steer a locomotive in the sky. Others questioned how such a beast could survive a dogfight against the nimble Bf-109 or the sleek FW-190. Yet the Army Air Corps, desperate for modern equipment as the war loomed, decided to take a gamble. Production orders were placed even before the prototype's flaws were resolved. Still, early field reports were far from flattering. British pilots who tested the P-47 under the Royal Air Force's evaluation program were unimpressed. They called it too big, too slow in the climb, and too thirsty. To them, it was a bomber that wanted to be a fighter, a machine unsuited for the swirling dance of aerial combat that had come to define the skies over Europe. In 1942, as America joined the war effort, the first P-47 units began to form. Among them was the 56th Fighter Group, a collection of eager but skeptical young men led by a forward-thinking commander named Hubert Zemke. Zemke was an experienced flyer who had spent time in England studying the Luftwaffe's tactics. When he first laid eyes on the Thunderbolt, he could hardly believe it was intended to fight the nimble German interceptors. It looked like a flying milk bottle, he joked, referencing the aircraft's bulbous fuselage. But Zemke was not a man who dismissed innovation. He saw potential where others saw a burden. At first, the Thunderbolt's flaws were painfully apparent. Takeoff accidents were frequent due to its long nose and limited forward visibility. Its enormous radial engine produced tremendous torque that could flip the aircraft during takeoff if not handled carefully. Its range was limited, making it unsuitable for deep escort missions into German territory. Mechanics wrestled with its complex turbo system, and pilots complained that it was a fuel-guzzling beast. Newspapers in the United States, eager for success stories, avoided mentioning these problems. But among the men who flew the early models, confidence was low. Then came the turning point, a shift not of engineering, but of understanding. Pilots began to recognize that the P-47 was not meant to fight like a Spitfire or a Mustang. It was not built for tight turns or delicate aerobatics. It was built for speed, strength, and survivability. With its thick armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and massive air-cooled engine, the Thunderbolt could absorb damage that would destroy any other fighter. In test after test, bullets that would have ignited or crippled liquid-cooled engines simply bounced off the jug's thick radial cylinders. Moreover, the P-47's dive performance was extraordinary. Its weight and aerodynamics allowed it to enter controlled dives at speeds that would tear lesser planes apart. Though pilots did not yet understand the full potential of this characteristic, it was the first hint of the tactic that would soon make the P-47 one of the most feared fighters in the European theater. By late 1942, Republic Aviation had begun ramping up production. Assembly lines in Farmingdale, Long Island, and Evansville, Indiana, worked day and night to meet the military's growing demands. Kartveli and his engineers refined the design, strengthening the airframe, improving the controls, and adding new features such as paddle blade propellers for better climb performance. Despite its rocky start, the Thunderbolt was evolving. In England, the 56th Fighter Group finally took its jugs into combat. At first, missions were routine, escorting bombers across the Channel, conducting fighter sweeps, and engaging enemy aircraft when possible. German pilots mocked the Thunderbolt, calling it the Fat One, unaware that this so-called lumbering machine would soon become their greatest nightmare. The first kill came in April 1943 when a P-47 pilot downed a Focke-Wulf 190 in a steep dive. It was a small victory, but symbolically it marked the beginning of a new chapter in aerial warfare. Kartveli, meanwhile, remained in the background, quietly watching his creation prove itself. He had faced ridicule and doubt, yet his vision, building a fighter around sheer power and rugged survivability, was beginning to pay off. The P-47's ability to operate at high altitudes, escort bombers, and deliver punishing firepower with its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns made it a formidable weapon. The same aircraft that engineers once called a flying bulldozer was now carving its legend across the European skies. Still, the true revolution was yet to come. It would not be discovered in the laboratories of Republic Aviation, nor in the blueprints of its designers. It would be discovered in the skies, through experience, trial, and the daring experiments of pilots who refused to accept limits. The P-47's pilots were about to learn that gravity itself could be a weapon. They would learn to turn their aircraft's weight, its greatest weakness, into an unstoppable advantage. And so, as 1943 dawned, the jug was finally ready for its baptism of fire. The Luftwaffe still ruled the air over Europe, but the balance of power was beginning to shift. The age of the high-speed dive, and the deadly new tactics it would inspire, was about to begin. In the spring of 1943, the air over Northern Europe was a dangerous place to be. The U.S. 8th Air Force had begun launching daylight bombing raids deep into German-occupied territory, believing that precision bombing in daylight could cripple the enemy's industrial machine. But those bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-2 for Liberators, were massive, slow-moving targets, and the Luftwaffe's swift Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s descended on them like hawks on pigeons. The American heavy bombers needed protection, and it was up to the pilots of the new Republic P-47 Thunderbolt to provide it. Few could have imagined that what began as desperation would evolve into one of the most decisive tactical shifts in World War II aerial combat. At the beginning of their deployment, Thunderbolt pilots struggled to find their place in the European sky. The Luftwaffe had years of experience in dogfighting, and German pilots knew how to exploit their lighter, more agile aircraft. When the 56th Fighter Group, the famed Zemke's Wolfpack, arrived in England in early 1943, their P-47s were still being fine-tuned for long-range escort. The early versions lacked drop tanks, limiting their reach to the coast of France. They could not yet accompany bombers to deep targets like Bremen or Schweinfurt. That left them to conduct fighter sweeps and limited escort duties, where they were often forced to confront the Luftwaffe's best pilots head-on. Colonel Hubert Zemke knew that fighting a Bf-109 on its own terms, tight turns and low-altitude maneuvering, was suicide. The Germans could outturn a Thunderbolt any day. What his men needed was a new way to fight, one that exploited the Thunderbolt's strengths rather than exposing its weaknesses. He began drilling his squadrons to fight in pairs and in altitude layers, keeping the element of surprise on their side. The key lay in the one thing the P-47 did better than almost any other fighter in the world: dive. Physics, it seemed, would be their greatest ally. The Thunderbolt's massive frame and powerful Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine gave it enormous kinetic energy in a descent. German fighters, with their lightweight airframes, could not follow without risking catastrophic failure. Zemke's pilots started experimenting, first cautiously, then with boldness born of necessity. They climbed to altitudes above 25,000 feet, often far higher than the Luftwaffe patrols. When enemy aircraft appeared below, they rolled their Thunderbolts onto their backs and plunged toward their prey in a steep, controlled dive that could exceed 500 miles per hour. The tactic was simple yet deadly: strike fast from above, unleash the 8.50 caliber machine guns in a single devastating burst, then pull out of the dive before the enemy could react. Instead of turning and twisting in endless dogfights, Thunderbolt pilots hit hard and used their momentum to climb back to safety. They called it boom and zoom. The Luftwaffe called it a nightmare. One of the earliest and most significant examples of this tactic came during a mission to Bremen in the summer of 1943. The 56th Fighter Group was assigned to protect a formation of B-17 bombers targeting the city's industrial facilities. As the bombers approached the target, radar operators in northern Germany scrambled dozens of FW-190s from bases near Oldenburg. They were climbing to intercept when Zemke's men, cruising at 28,000 feet, spotted them below. Zemke gave the order, "Let's go hunting." The Thunderbolts rolled over and dived. Pilots described the sensation as terrifying and exhilarating at once. The cockpit shook violently as the altimeter spun like a clock on overdrive. The controls stiffened and the noise of wind and metal became deafening. Some aircraft approached transonic speeds, where airflow compressibility caused the controls to lock, a dangerous condition pilots were only beginning to understand. Yet in that deadly descent, the jug came alive. Major Francis Gabreski, one of Zemke's most aggressive pilots, later recalled, "You had to fight the controls all the way down, but when you lined up the shot, nothing could survive it in that single mission." Gabreski and his squadron downed several FW-190s before the Germans even realized they were under attack. When the Thunderbolts pulled up and climbed back toward the bombers, the Luftwaffe pilots tried to follow and lost wings or control surfaces in the attempt. For the first time, the tide of the air war seemed to shift. The dive tactic worked because it turned the Thunderbolts' weight into energy. Every pound of metal became an advantage in the descent. The aircraft's thick wings and strong structure allowed it to survive dives that would have destroyed the lighter Messerschmitts. The P-47's radial engine, air-cooled rather than liquid-cooled, could absorb damage from flak or gunfire and keep running. German pilots quickly learned that shooting at a Thunderbolt's front was almost pointless. The big radial engine acted like a shield. As 1943 progressed, reports of Thunderbolt victories multiplied. Pilots began to take pride in their aircraft's reputation for invincibility. Lieutenant Walker Bud Mahurin, another ace of the 56th Fighter Group, demonstrated the jug's incredible strength when his aircraft returned to base with over 200 bullet holes and oil leaking across the canopy. He survived, landed safely, and flew again the next day. Stories like his spread quickly, boosting morale across Allied air units. The German High Command, accustomed to air superiority, was stunned by the sudden rise in American fighter success. The Luftwaffe was forced to adapt. New Focke-Wulf FW-19OE models were equipped with stronger wings and compressed air flaps to improve dive recovery. Still, they could not match the Thunderbolt's sheer durability. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter leaders, later admitted that the P-47 was a formidable enemy, especially in the dive. By the end of 1943, Zemke's Wolfpack had become a symbol of American air power. The boom and zoom method was no longer an experiment, it was doctrine. The 56th Fighter Group trained new squadrons in high-altitude energy fighting, teaching them to use altitude as a weapon. The principles of energy management, acceleration, and dive recovery that they pioneered would shape aerial tactics for generations to come. Even beyond the tactical advantage, the P-47's dive ability had strategic consequences. It allowed the U.S. to maintain bomber formations longer and reduce losses over German territory. Pilots no longer had to escort bombers by flying in tight defensive patterns. Instead, they could roam above the bombers, ready to swoop down on attackers and then climb back to position. This freedom of movement increased bomber survivability dramatically. The press back home began to take notice. American newspapers started calling the Thunderbolt the toughest fighter in the sky. The public, hungry for heroes, celebrated Zemke, Gabreski, and Johnson as national icons. Propaganda reels showed footage of the P-47 roaring down through clouds, guns blazing, symbolizing American might and innovation. Yet behind the spectacle lay real physics, real blood, and real courage. Pilots had to master the art of controlling dives that flirted with the limits of what their aircraft and their bodies could endure. The high-speed dive was not without danger. Many Thunderbolt pilots experienced compressibility, a mysterious aerodynamic phenomenon that caused the controls to freeze during steep descents. Before the widespread understanding of transonic flight, this effect was terrifying. Several aircraft were lost when pilots could not pull out of dives in time. Engineers at Republic Aviation and NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, worked frantically to study the airflow problems. Their research into the P-47's dive behavior would later influence jet aircraft design, including early supersonic projects after the war. As Zemke later reflected, the Thunderbolt made you respect gravity. You could use it as a weapon, but only if you understood it. His men did. They had turned a supposed disadvantage, size and weight, into a lethal advantage. In doing so, they had transformed aerial combat from a contest of agility into one of speed, energy, and vertical maneuvering. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's confidence had been shaken. The Thunderbolt's booming dives, devastating gun passes, and unmatched toughness had proven that American air power was not just about numbers, it was about ingenuity and adaptation. The once-derided Jug had become the hammer of the skies, pounding German airfields, trains, and convoys with deadly precision. The lesson was clear: in war, innovation has not always come from design alone. Sometimes it comes from the courage of those who dare to experiment in the heat of battle. The high-speed dive, a simple exploitation of gravity and engineering, had changed the course of air combat forever. And for the P-47 Thunderbolt, this was only the beginning. Ahead lay even greater challenges, and among those who faced them was a young pilot named Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, whose story would define the courage and endurance of the men who flew the Jug. In the summer of 1943, as the Allied bombing campaign intensified over Europe, the skies became a crucible of fire and metal. Every mission tested not just the machinery of war, but the men who flew it. For the young American pilots of the P-47 Thunderbolt, it was an era of learning, sometimes slow, often deadly. And among those young flyers was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a 23-year-old from Lawton, Oklahoma, whose name would become synonymous with endurance, courage, and the very spirit of the Jug. When Johnson first arrived at the 56th Fighter Group's base in Halesworth, England, he was just one of many rookies thrown into a world dominated by veterans of the Luftwaffe. The German pilots they faced had been fighting since the Spanish Civil War and the early days of Blitzkrieg. They had mastered the art of aerial combat. The Americans, by contrast, were still learning to coordinate large formations, manage fuel, and survive long missions across the hostile expanse of occupied Europe. Johnson himself later admitted that he felt utterly unprepared for the war he was about to face. The early missions were brutal lessons. The P-47's range, though improving with the addition of drop tanks, still limited how deep into Germany the escorts could go. Bomber crews often had to continue their deadly runs without fighter protection. When the Thunderbolts turned for home, they frequently left behind burning B-17s and B-24s, helpless against swarming German fighters. This sense of guilt and helplessness weighed heavily on the escort pilots. But there was no choice. Until longer-range aircraft, like the P-51 Mustang, arrived, the Thunderbolt was the best weapon they had. Johnson's baptism of fire came during a mission over the French coast in June 1943. Flying in a tight escort formation, his flight was jumped by a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s. The Germans attacked in waves, diving through the bomber formation and then climbing away, using tactics perfected over years of war. Johnson managed to get behind one enemy aircraft and opened fire. The P-47's 8.50 caliber machine guns tore into the FW-190, shredding its fuselage before it spiraled into the clouds below. It was Johnson's first kill, and his first realization that the Thunderbolt, in the right hands, was a weapon of devastating power. But the victory came at a price. Johnson's aircraft was hit repeatedly by cannon shells, damaging his controls and filling the cockpit with smoke. He barely managed to return to base, where his crew chief counted over 100 holes in the fuselage. From that day, Johnson learned a fundamental truth about the Jug. It could take punishment like no other fighter in the sky. It was not just a machine of war, it was a fortress in the air. Over the next months, the 56th Fighter Group refined their combat techniques. Under the leadership of Colonel Hubert Zemke, discipline replaced chaos. Pilots learned to fight in pairs, maintaining visual contact and protecting each other's blind spots. No more reckless solo chases or emotional dogfights. Zemke's Wolfpack became a coordinated, strategic weapon. The pilots of the group trained endlessly on the concept of energy fighting, always diving with speed, climbing with precision, and never engaging in horizontal turns where the Germans had the advantage. The motto was simple: hit hard, hit once, and live to fight again. By the fall of 1943, Robert Johnson was no longer a rookie. He was now an ace, a title earned by scoring 5 confirmed aerial victories. Yet his most famous mission, the one that would make him a legend, came not from success, but from survival. On June 26, 1943, Johnson joined a bomber escort mission deep into France. His P-47, named Half Pint, was hit by flak near Rouen. The explosion damaged his canopy and control surfaces. Before he could recover, a German FW-190 pounced on him, riddling his Thunderbolt with gunfire. Oil splattered across his windscreen, smoke filled the cockpit, and bullets smashed through his armor plate. Then the FW-190 returned for the kill. Johnson later described the harrowing encounter in his memoir, Thunderbolt. He came in from behind, his cannon flashing. The bullets tore into my wings, my fuselage, my tail. The airplane shook violently, but the engine kept running. He made pass after pass, and I could not fight back. For nearly 10 minutes, Johnson's crippled aircraft absorbed hundreds of rounds. The German pilot, incredulous that his target would not fall, finally broke off and saluted before flying away. Somehow, Johnson managed to bring his shattered Thunderbolt home, crash landing at an airfield in England. His aircraft had been struck more than 200 times, yet it had kept him alive. That event was widely reported and became a symbol of the Thunderbolt's legendary toughness. Photographs of Johnson's bullet-riddled aircraft circulated through newspapers, inspiring American morale and terrifying the Luftwaffe. Johnson's survival was not luck, it was proof of Alexander Kartveli's design philosophy, that strength and resilience could be just as deadly as speed or grace. As Johnson's reputation grew, so did that of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke's Wolfpack became the most feared American fighter unit in the European theater. They developed a reputation for precision and aggression. Each pilot knew his role in the formation. Discipline was paramount. Those who disobeyed orders or broke formation in pursuit of personal glory were grounded. Zemke drilled his men with an almost academic rigor, emphasizing the science of flight, understanding airspeed, altitude, and the conservation of energy. "The sky is a laboratory," Zemke often said, "and we are the experiment." Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was beginning to feel the strain. Allied bombing raids were intensifying, forcing German fighters to engage in multiple sorties per day. Fuel shortages and the loss of experienced pilots were crippling their effectiveness. For the first time since 1939, the hunters were becoming the hunted. Thunderbolt pilots, once mocked for their heavy, lumbering aircraft, now struck fear into their opponents. The Americans were also learning valuable lessons about teamwork and communication. Radio discipline improved. Commanders began coordinating between bomber and fighter units, creating combined mission strategies. Pilots learned to rely on radar vectors and ground controllers, anticipating enemy movements rather than reacting to them. It was an era of rapid evolution in aerial warfare, where each mission brought new knowledge, often purchased with the lives of brave young men. The growing success of the P-47 squadrons had another effect. It changed how the Allies viewed air superiority. Before 1943, the concept of escorting bombers with fighters all the way to target and back was seen as impractical. The Thunderbolt proved otherwise. By extending its range with external fuel tanks and perfecting high-altitude combat tactics, it could accompany bombers deep into enemy territory and engage German interceptors head-on. This shift allowed the U.S. 8th Air Force to press harder and further, striking vital targets such as ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and rail hubs. But progress always came with sacrifice. Many of Zemke's original pilots did not live to see the war's end. Names were added to the missing in action lists after nearly every major raid. Johnson himself narrowly escaped death more than once, his aircraft battered but unbowed. The emotional toll on the pilots was immense. They were young men forced to mature under the constant shadow of death. Between missions, the airfields were quiet places, men cleaning guns, writing letters home, and staring at the English sky, knowing that the next mission could be their last. As 1944 dawned, the experience and discipline forged in those brutal months began to pay dividends. The P-47s were now striking deep into Germany, strafing trains, convoys, and airfields. Their 8 heavy machine guns were devastating against ground targets. What had started as an air superiority fighter had evolved into a versatile, multi-role war machine. The Jug could fight, dive, climb, and bomb, and it could do all of it while surviving damage that would destroy most aircraft. For Robert Johnson and his comrades, the transformation was both tactical and personal. They had grown from uncertain rookies into hardened veterans. They had learned to trust their aircraft, their wingmen, and their commanders. They had learned that survival in the sky depended not on instinct alone, but on discipline, teamwork, and understanding the science of flight. By the time Johnson returned to the United States in 1944, he was credited with 27 aerial victories, second only to Gabreski among American aces in Europe. His story, like that of the Thunderbolt itself, became a testament to the idea that adaptation and resilience could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The lessons of the front line, of courage, innovation, and human endurance had turned skepticism into mastery. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter. It was a symbol of American engineering, of pilot ingenuity, and of a nation's determination to win. And yet, the story was not finished. Behind every victory in the sky lay the genius of the engineers who had built the machine. To understand the full miracle of the Jug, one must look beyond the cockpit and into the laboratories and factories where innovation became victory. In the late months of 1944, while Allied forces fought their way across France and the skies above Europe thundered with the roar of engines, engineers and historians alike began to realize that one of the unsung heroes of the air war was not just the men who flew, but the machine that carried them, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Its success was not the result of luck or mere circumstance. It was the product of vision, physics, and an extraordinary marriage between human ingenuity and industrial power. The Thunderbolt's design story was one of engineering defiance. When Alexander Kartveli conceived the aircraft in 1940, he broke nearly every conventional rule of fighter design. At a time when the world celebrated light and agile fighters like the British Spitfire or the German Bf 109, Kartveli dared to build a machine that was heavy, massive, and unapologetically overpowered. Yet, this unconventional design would become one of the most advanced and rugged aircraft of World War II. At the heart of the Thunderbolt was its mighty Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine. This 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine was a mechanical marvel capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower, driving the P-47 to speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour. Its robust construction meant it could absorb tremendous damage and continue to run. Unlike liquid-cooled engines used by the Spitfire or Mustang, the R-2800 did not rely on vulnerable coolant systems. A single bullet through a radiator could doom those fighters, but the Thunderbolt's engine could keep turning even with entire cylinders shot away. But what truly set the P-47 apart was its turbo-supercharger system, an engineering masterpiece that made the aircraft a true high-altitude predator. Located in the rear fuselage, the turbo-supercharger compressed thin, high-altitude air before feeding it back to the engine. This allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain full power above 25,000 feet, a crucial advantage in the high-altitude battles over Europe. The system, though complex, gave the P-47 unmatched performance where other fighters gasped for air. The extensive ducting required for the system added weight and bulk, but it also made the Thunderbolt a technological leap forward in understanding how to control airflow and temperature under extreme conditions. This complexity made maintenance difficult. Ground crews nicknamed the turbo system the plumber's nightmare, yet they admired it. Mechanics knew that every component, from the stainless steel ducts to the wastegate regulators, was built for durability. Even when the aircraft returned riddled with bullet holes, the turbo-supercharger often survived intact, a testament to its design. The P-47's frame itself was a marvel of strength. Its thick wings, with internal spars and reinforced skin, allowed it to dive safely at speeds well over 500 miles per hour. In an era before the widespread understanding of compressibility and transonic flight, this capability was astonishing. Pilots reported that the Thunderbolt could descend faster than anything else in the sky without losing structural integrity. German pilots soon learned that chasing a diving Jug was a death sentence. Their lighter aircraft could not withstand the same pressures. Republic engineers, working closely with NACA, investigated the effects of high-speed airflow on the P-47. Their research into compressibility and dive recovery not only made the Thunderbolt safer, but also paved the way for post-war jet research. Test reports from Wright Field and Eglin Air Base in 1943 documented dives reaching 600 miles per hour, speeds that approached the edge of the sound barrier. These were among the earliest controlled studies of near-transonic flight in history. Armor protection was another defining feature. The P-47's cockpit was surrounded by steel plates and bullet-resistant glass. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to swell and close when punctured. These innovations, while adding weight, saved countless lives. Robert S. Johnson's legendary survival after taking more than 200 hits was proof of this design philosophy in action. The Thunderbolt could bring pilots home even when logic said it should have fallen from the sky. As the war progressed, the P-47 evolved. Later versions, like the P-47D and P-47M, incorporated stronger engines, paddle blade propellers, and enhanced fuel systems. These upgrades pushed the aircraft's top speed to over 470 miles per hour in level flight. The Jug, once considered too heavy for combat, had become one of the fastest piston engine fighters in the world. The Thunderbolt's impact went beyond the battlefield. Its production symbolized the industrial might of the United States. Republic Aviation's factories in Farmingdale, Long Island, and Evansville, Indiana, operated around the clock, employing thousands of men and women. Between 1942 and 1945, nearly 15,700 Thunderbolts were built, making it one of the most produced American fighters of the war. The coordination between engineers, assembly line workers, and combat units demonstrated the power of mass production and teamwork, the essence of wartime America. By late 1944, the P-47 was flying not only with the U.S. Army Air Forces, but also with the Royal Air Force, Free French units, and Soviet Air Forces. It became an international symbol of allied strength. Its adaptability to different climates and missions, from escorting bombers at 30,000 feet to blasting tanks in Normandy, earned it universal respect. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the P-47 had achieved an astonishing combat record. It destroyed over 3,700 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and thousands more on the ground. Its pilots included some of America's top aces: Francis Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, David Schilling, and Walker Mahurin. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was shattered. Much of that victory could be traced back to the Thunderbolt's unique combination of technology, endurance, and firepower. In the post-war years, historians and engineers looked back on the P-47 as a turning point in aviation history. It represented the moment when aircraft design transitioned from intuitive artistry to applied science. Its engineers had embraced complexity, understanding that power, durability, and innovation could coexist. The lessons learned from its turbo-supercharger and aerodynamic testing directly influenced the design of early jet fighters, such as the F-86 Sabre and the Republic F-8 for Thunderjet. Even as newer, sleeker jets replaced it, the Thunderbolt's legend endured. In Korea, a modified version, the P-47UN, continued to serve as a fighter-bomber. Pilots still spoke of its reliability and the sense of invincibility it gave them. In museums and air shows today, restored Thunderbolts stand as monuments to an age when courage and engineering walked hand in hand. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately a story of transformation. It began as an object of skepticism, a fighter too heavy, too complicated, and too strange to succeed. But in the crucible of war, it became a machine of unmatched power and endurance. It dominated the skies not because it was perfect, but because its pilots and engineers learned how to use its imperfections as strengths. From the workshops of Republic Aviation to the dogfights above Europe, the Thunderbolt embodied the relentless drive of innovation that defined the American spirit during World War II. It was not the prettiest fighter, nor the most graceful, but it was the one that came home, time and time again. As Allied pilots watched the fires of war fade over Europe, they knew they had flown something extraordinary. The P-47 Thunderbolt had done more than just fight. It had changed the way humanity understood flight, endurance, and the science of survival in the thin air where man and machine met their limits. Its roar still echoes in history, the sound of a machine that proved that even gravity could be turned into a weapon.